There had been a time when the Browns appeared before the world as a courageous experiment in love, faith, and oneness. A plural marriage family, yes, but also a family bound by a common vision. One home, one heart, and above all else, one economic future. The family pot wasn't simply a figure of speech. It existed, it was holy, and it was constructed of many decades of collective sacrifice. Mary, Janelle, and Christine were not only wives but investors, co-founders, the first planners of a shared vision. They invested paychecks, hours, emotional labor, and dignity, sometimes at the expense of their own security, to create something that could hold up to public judgment, private mayhem, and fiscal uncertainty. But in the background of the TLC cameras, as the audience watched the mess unravel with a bag of popcorn, a silent betrayal unfolded. Not the kind you shout about in a therapy session. No, this betrayal was colder, quieter, and more calculated. It was strategic. It was financial. And at its center, some now argue, was Robyn Brown. The $500,000 nanny debt is more than a headline. It's a crack in the wall that indicates the rot beneath, the trail of privilege that Robyn is accused of having walked, while the rest of the family staggered. The question ringing through Reddit forums, YouTube breakdowns, and fan sites is straightforward but crushing. Did Robyn pay her nanny out of the family pot of money? The same pot that Christine's children relied on for stability? The same one Janelle spent decades filling up and working full-time jobs in administration and finance? The same pot that covered food, rent, baby food, orthodontia, and decades of unpaid emotional labor that Mary did raising Leon by herself when Kody vanished into other homes? The concept of a nanny wasn't only unconventional, it was unimaginable in the early years. Christine brought up 13 children on her own, with no assistance, and coordinated meals, emotions, education, and religion. She did so without ever being presented with an offer of a paid aide, never mind a full-time nanny. So, when Robyn, then not working, asked and was given paid assistance, it caused a chilling ripple effect throughout the family. But it did not end in a little overtime babysitting. Fan research and reports indicate Robyn spent more than $500,000 on nanny care over several years, care that she purportedly utilized when remaining at home, sleeping, decorating, and being the always put-together wife who was always relaxed and completely available to Kody, both physically and emotionally. Meanwhile, the other wives buckled under the demands of single motherhood in stunned silence, and Robyn subcontracted her responsibilities, and the Browns footed the bill. But where was the money from? Because Robyn's own income was zero. Her boutique on the internet never gained traction. Her line of jewelry disappeared quietly. Her public outing was minimal. So when the nanny bills came due, fans began to put two and two together. TLC's payments, which typically were put at more than $25,000 to $40,000 per episode when the show was popular, were apparently paid not to each of the wives individually, but into a single fund controlled by Kody. That fund, according to various statements by members of the family throughout the years, was the so-called family pot. It was meant to be the pool from which joint expenses, such as housing, groceries, school supplies, and emergencies, were drawn. But inevitably, it was seen that this pot was no longer being shared fairly. And Robyn? She was gorging on the lion's share. Let's look at the timeline. While the family relocated from Utah to Las Vegas, every wife was given her own house. For once, fairness reigned. But once Flagstaff came into the picture, equity gave way to consolidation. Kody insisted on selling the Vegas homes, Janelle's, Christine's, and Mary's, and investing the profits into Coyote Pass, a plot of land that was never developed, riddled with zoning issues, water problems, and legal confusion. While those women watched their financial security be buried under Arizona dirt, Robyn and Kody made a very different choice. They spent part of the same money, real estate records and inside sources confirm, to buy a huge $890,000 house in Flagstaff and one with forest views, several bedrooms, and lots of room for her children and her nanny. That home wasn't listed in the name of the Brown family group. It was bought for Robyn and Kody. So, as the rest of the family waited for blueprints to turn into homes, Robyn settled into a palace, reportedly paid for by the group wealth, funds that Janelle and Christine rightfully viewed as their children's inheritance. And throughout it all, the nanny remained on payroll. Viewers were shocked during the pandemic when Robyn would not budge on the nanny matter. While Isabel, Christine's daughter, was getting ready for life-saving scoliosis surgery, Kody wasn't willing to fly with her due to strict COVID regulations. But the same regulations hadn't been holding Robyn's nanny back. Christine finally snapped, "What does the nanny do?" It was not frustration alone. It was the point at which the entire illusion came crashing down. Robyn's nanny continued to show up at the house, get paid, get protected, get prioritized, while Christine was on her own to deal with her daughter's suffering. And it wasn't just emotional suffering. Isabel's surgery wasn't paid for by some kind of golden TLC healthcare plan. There was a GoFundMe, a GoFundMe, for the daughter of a guy who got to live in a mansion. That's when the public outrage became personal. How is it that a family, one that was publicized all over the country, couldn't pay for a teenage daughter to have surgery? How didn't the father chip in? The response, say some, is that that money was being spent elsewhere. On nannies, on Robyn, on a definition of family that excluded the original 13 children. And don't forget about Garrison, Janelle's son, double shifts, pinching pennies, desperate to break from a father who instructed him to pay rent, a father who resided in $1 million mansion, a father who, rather than providing assistance, accused his sons of freeloaders. This was not tough love, it was systematic disinheritance. Gabe, who just wished his father would remember his birthday, was overlooked. Not metaphorically, literally. Kody phoned only to inquire about COVID, unaware that it was Gabe's special day. A son, dwindled to a statistic. A father, emotionally depleted. And whereas the public was gaga over the emotional aspect, lost was the financial underpinning. That Kody, by all indications, had already written his elder children off. Not merely emotionally, but financially. Because if they were not living with Robyn, they were not included in the plan. That plan was brutally revealed by the formation of Dabsark LLC, a corporate entity whose name itself is a resounding red flag. Dayton, Aurora, Brianna, Solomon, Ariella, Robyn, Kody. No Janelle, no Christine, no Mary, not any of the original kids. The idea is that any future profits from the Sister Wives brand, or any licensing or spin-offs, would be routed through that business, legally limited to Robyn and her kids, so the nanny fees? They're just one tile in a giant mosaic of diversion, money pouring steadily from a common dream into a private fiefdom. They started questioning the difficult questions. How did Robyn justify $500K in nanny expenses when Christine, who cared for double the number of children, never spent a penny? Why did Robyn's kids get designer rings while Isabel went crowdfund for surgery? How did Kody sleep at night in a mansion purchased with community funds while Garrison lived paycheck to paycheck? And how did the family let this occur without rebellion? The response is, eventually, they didn't. Christine went first. Her leaving was not only emotional, it was financial. She sold her house. She tapped out. She invested in Utah. That duplex she purchased? That's not merely a residence. That's a declaration. That's an egg bank. Janelle did the same. The figures no longer added up. The property was a trap. The trust was shattered. Even Mary, the most devoted, finally cut out. And Robyn? She remained. Unfazed. Unrepentant. Kody drew a circle around her. And the pot? It was empty. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it was never empty at all. Perhaps it was redirected, rerouted, taken, which leads us right back to the nanny. $500,000 for babysitting in a household that professed to live modestly. In a household where other children were instructed to look out for themselves. In a household that forged its glory through mutual sacrifice. What does the nanny do? She's the icon, the bill. The inescapable evidence that the family pot turned into Robyn's purse. That the dynasty turned into a dictatorship. And that for the OG wives and their children, what was once promised turned into a myth. A fairy tale stolen from its ending by the very woman who vowed she just wanted to belong. If part 1 exposed the crack in the foundation of the Brown family legacy, then part 2 lays bare the blueprint of the financial betrayal that has quietly fractured a once unified household into isolated fiefdoms, each ruled by either grief, survival, or delusion. Because to understand how a single woman like Robyn could allegedly redirect over $500,000 for private childcare while her sister wives' children went without, you have to understand how Kody Brown's role shifted from being a self-proclaimed family steward into the CEO of an emotionally collapsing corporation who began treating wives and children as assets or liabilities, depending on their proximity to his new nucleus, Robyn, her 5 children, and a lifestyle built on the ashes of everyone else's sacrifices. And it didn't happen all at once because betrayal never does. It starts with silence, with small exceptions, with privileges that are framed as necessities and decisions that are wrapped in the language of love, but in truth, are about power, and Robyn, whether intentionally or by survival instinct, became not just Kody's favorite, but his financial filter, the lens through which all decisions passed. Because as other wives voiced concerns about money, about fairness, about emotional neglect, Kody heard only noise. But when Robyn cried, when Robyn requested, he responded like a man trying to preserve the only version of his life that still fed his ego, his legacy, and his control. And the $500,000 nanny bill isn't just a number. It's a symbol of what happens when one member of a collective is allowed to operate without transparency, accountability, or consequences. Because according to insiders and statements made by the family themselves, Robyn had her own separate bank accounts, separate access to TLC income streams, and more influence over how the shared pot was divided than any of the other wives. And while Christine and Janelle were budgeting groceries and calculating school fees, Robyn had a nanny, multiple vehicles, private tutors, and access to every comfort imaginable, and that comfort didn't come from some mysterious, independent income. It came allegedly from the collective earnings of the family brand, a brand built on the labor and pain of all 4 wives and their 18 children. Not just one household. And yet, in the years following Robyn's entrance into the family, viewers began to notice a shift. Not just in screen time, but in narrative tone, as more and more of the family's journey became centered around her concerns, her emotions, her needs, and then came the infamous divorce between Kody and Meri, framed publicly as a selfless legal move to allow Robyn's children from her previous marriage to be adopted. But behind the legal technicality was a seismic shift in power, because by marrying Robyn legally, Kody transferred not just a title, but full financial and legal authority over assets, insurance, and future inheritance rights to her and her children. And if you still think this wasn't strategic, remember this: Robyn and Kody didn't adopt Meri's child, or Janelle's, or Christine's, because their children weren't part of the new kingdom being built. They were relics of the past, and if you follow the money trail from that point forward, you'll find a pattern: shared homes sold, individual equity absorbed, promises of joint construction delayed, then ignored, and amidst all this chaos, Robyn's lifestyle remained consistent, comfortable, and protected. And the more Christine and Janelle pushed back, the more Kody withdrew, emotionally and financially, leaving behind sons who had to beg for respect, daughters who had to crowdfund for medical treatment, and wives who were told that if they didn't like it, they could leave. Because the plan, it now seems, was to create just that: a purge, a collapse of the old system to make way for a new one, where Robyn reigned, not as one wife among many, but as the last standing matriarch of a financial empire built on the backs of women who were no longer welcome at the table. And fans noticed that the show itself began to reflect this shift, with camera time increasingly focused on Robyn's emotional reactions, her concerns about unity, and her constant lament that the family was falling apart. Yet she made no visible effort to sacrifice her comforts to bring it back together. She kept the nanny, she kept the house, she kept Kody, while Christine was told to pack his things in a garage, while Janelle was told to live in an RV on barren land. And when asked why Robyn needed a nanny, no one got a straight answer. Because the real answer, the one no one wanted to say, was that Robyn wasn't living the same reality as the others. She was living in a protected sphere, a curated world where needs were met, emotions were validated, and financial discomfort never touched her doorstep. And that protection came at the cost of the others' dignity, their independence, and their futures. Because when you tally up the money from the Vegas home sales, add in the TLC checks, subtract the cost of land that remains undeveloped, and factor in the luxury home now exclusively occupied by Robyn and Kody, it becomes impossible to justify the nanny expense as anything but emblematic of a broader, more sinister strategy: isolate, absorb, consolidate, because a nanny is not a necessity in a family that once prided itself on raising kids together. It is a tool, a convenience, and in this case, an ongoing financial insult to every other wife who carried the weight of parenthood alone. And while Robyn may say she needed help, the reality is that everyone needed help. Christine needed help when she had 5 kids under 10. Janelle needed help when she worked full-time and came home to chaos. Meri needed help when her emotional support system evaporated. But none of them got it. They got judgment, they got neglect. They got sermons about unity while watching resources disappear. And the moment the financial fog began to clear, when fans and family members alike began questioning the imbalance, the response wasn't accountability, it was silence, or worse, deflection. With Kody blaming disloyalty, COVID protocols, or emotional disconnection, anything to avoid admitting the truth, that he had created a 2-tiered system, a new monarchy ruled by Robyn, funded by the leftovers of a crumbling empire that once belonged to all of them. And as the wives began leaving, one by one, the pattern was undeniable. The more they pulled away, the clearer the imbalance became. Because if Christine's departure didn't lead to financial collapse, if Janelle's exit didn't cause bankruptcy, then where had all the money really been going? Who had been stockpiling the resources? Who had been shielded while others endured scarcity? The responses all lead the same way. And that way is not multiple, it is one. And her name is Robyn. And the $500,000 nanny statistic is more than just an accounting footnote. It is a reflection, the whole rot beneath the surface of what was once referred to as sister wives, but now better described as a fallen kingdom constructed from shattered promises and pilfered futures. If the emotional unraveling of the Brown family was already visible by the time Christine packed Kody's belongings into the garage, then by the time Janelle voiced her refusal to continue following orders that benefited only one household, the illusion of unity had completely disintegrated, and what remained was no longer a plural family. It was a monarchy masquerading as a modern polygamist household, and at the center of this broken structure stood Robyn, not merely as a wife, but as a symbol of systemic imbalance, privilege, and financial redirection. And while Kody continued to insist on loyalty and obedience, what he really meant was submission to a system that no longer served everyone equally. Because behind the spiritual language and talk of unity was a cold, calculated redistribution of wealth, where every decision, every expense, every future plan was centered around protecting Robyn's lifestyle at the cost of the other wives' stability and the children's inheritance. And nowhere was this more clear than in the alleged continuation of high-cost nanny services, even as other family members were downsizing, scraping by or left to fend for themselves entirely. Because while Kody's rhetoric painted a picture of a father concerned with safety, the reality, documented on camera, showed a man enforcing rules selectively, with Robyn's comfort and household standing apart, insulated and uninterrupted. And fans who watched closely began to notice what the show itself could not conceal, that during the most emotionally volatile moments in the family's history, when Kody was melting down, ranting about betrayal, or isolating himself from the children who dared question his authority, Robyn's home remained the safe zone, the place where he rested, laughed, shared meals, while Christine, Janelle, and even Mary existed in emotional exile, reduced to awkward visits and tense conversations. And if you zoom out, the pattern becomes even clearer. Because while the OG wives were pushing strollers through financial uncertainty, Robyn entered the family with debt. And according to multiple sources, that debt, estimated by some at over $30,000, was quietly absorbed into the family pot. Forgiven not with conversation or transparency, but with quiet redirection of resources. And that set the tone for everything that followed, because what began with covering her debt extended to covering her expenses, including but not limited to childcare. Which brings us back to the $500,000 that remains one of the most damning financial figures associated with the Brown family, $500,000 for nanny services, while Isabel had to ask the public for help affording surgery, while Gabe had his birthday forgotten, while Garrison was told he owed rent to his own father, while Mykelti had to borrow from her in-laws for a home, while Gwen wondered aloud why her dad didn't seem to care, and while Truly had to navigate her parents' divorce without the presence of the man who once promised to be there for all of them. Because if Robyn's nanny fees were truly funded from the family pot, then every dollar spent was a dollar taken from someone else. Money that could have paid for college funds, rent, medical costs, therapy, down payments, car repairs, or even just peace of mind. And this isn't speculation for the sake of drama. It's a documented shift in priorities that unfolded slowly, publicly, and painfully on national television, as the show's tone shifted from one of curiosity about plural living to one of voyeurism into dysfunction and favoritism. And at the heart of this was Kody's complete transformation from a man who once championed balance to a man who openly admitted he was no longer interested in making things equal. And the justification was always the same: loyalty, unity, and respect. But the criteria for earning his affection had narrowed so much that it now only fit the shape of one household. And when you follow the financial consequences of that favoritism, what you find is a long trail of sacrifices made by women who were not just emotionally discarded, but financially undermined. Because while Robyn was building her fortress, literally and metaphorically, Christine was dealing with the emotional fallout of her children seeing their father retreat. Janelle was holding on to hope while living in a trailer. Mary was drowning in silence. And their children were growing up watching what it means to be loved conditionally, because they saw their father attend every event in Robyn's household, but miss theirs. They saw gifts given generously to one set of siblings while others were told to earn it themselves, and they internalized what the audience also began to realize: that this wasn't a family struggling under the weight of plural marriage. It was a system that had collapsed under the imbalance of power and the manipulation of finances. And when fans began demanding answers, the questions weren't just about who was right or wrong. They were about accountability, about how a father of 18 could allow such a stark disparity to grow unchecked, and how a woman like Robyn, who claimed to care about the unity of the family, could continue accepting luxury while knowing others were sacrificing. And this is why the nanny issue became the symbol of betrayal. Because it wasn't just about hiring help, it was about who was funding it, and why that funding was deemed acceptable while other needs were dismissed. And what began as subtle financial favoritism eventually became open disdain, with Kody calling his sons entitled, blaming his wives for their disrespect, and insisting on gratitude while refusing to offer support. And it all comes back to the question, what does the nanny do? Because the nanny symbolized Robyn's freedom to live another life, a life where emotional labor could be outsourced, where domestic chaos could be contained, where she could appear for Kody calm, supportive, and emotionally present. while the other wives were drowning in fatigue. And if that dynamic was underwritten by the joint income of the family, then it wasn't a difference in lifestyle. It was a difference in value, one that Kody underscored every time he didn't show up for anyone else. And as fans dug through financial records, timelines, and episodes, what they saw was a portrait of gradual but intentional financial consolidation, where each step, selling homes, stalling builds, switching contracts, had one result: keeping Robyn safe. And that safety came at everyone else's expense. Because whether the $500K came directly from TLC checks, from home equity, or from joint accounts, it didn't come from Robyn's solo income, and that means it came from the family, from women who had worked, sacrificed, and stayed long before she got there. And children who lived their lives on television so their father could build a brand that no longer paid dividends to them. And so when audiences respond in outrage, it's not about numbers, it's about betrayal. About the breach of an unspoken contract because the Brown family invited the world to see their journey under the banner of faith and unity. But what they produced, especially in the later seasons, was a textbook example of how unbridled power and favoritism can financially destroy even the most idealistic systems. And at the center of that case, the key exhibit is the nanny, the receipts nobody wants to produce, and the silence that speaks volumes. If by now it seems that Robyn's $500 nanny expense was merely the financial cherry on top of a mountain of quiet manipulations, then Part 4 takes us to the true heart of the operation, a behind-the-scenes corporate coup in which Kody and Robyn didn't just shift attention or affection away from the rest of the family, but allegedly engineered a complete and total economic restructuring that erased the OG wives and children from any meaningful control over the brand they helped build. And if that sounds like an exaggeration, then consider this. While Christine was selling her Flagstaff home and downsizing into a Utah duplex, while Janelle was stepping into financial uncertainty with no property in her name, and while Mary clung to the remains of a spiritual bond that had already been legally severed, Kody and Robyn were creating a legal entity, Dabsark Entertainment LLC, that not only excluded the other wives, but literally named only Robyn's children in its acronym: Dayton, Aurora, Brianna, Solomon, Ariella, Robyn, and Kody. And if you're wondering what that means in practice, it means this. The very income that the public assumed was going into a shared family pot may have quietly been rerouted into a private corporate structure that legally ensured that only Robyn's biological children had a stake in the future of the Sister Wives brand. And while the show continued using footage of Christine's breakdowns, Janelle's confrontations, and Mary's silence to keep ratings high and viewers engaged, the financial benefit of that exploitation may have gone solely to those whose names were on the LLC. And that's not just emotional betrayal, that's brand embezzlement in everything but legal terms. And the timeline supports it. Because shortly after the Flagstaff move, not only did the structure of the show begin to shift toward a narrative centered on Kody and Robyn's struggles to hold the family together, despite being the very ones who were benefiting from its collapse, but also the control of assets, decision-making, and long-term planning fell increasingly under their purview. And while the other wives were left to navigate legal limbo, failed land developments, and emotionally manipulative conversations, Kody and Robyn were sitting in meetings, signing documents, consolidating income streams, and making sure that whatever money came in, it didn't need to be shared the way it once was. And if that sounds nefarious, it's because it is. And the irony is that it was all done under the guise of protecting the family, preserving unity, and managing logistics. But let's call it what it really was: a silent takeover, one masked as necessity, disguised as leadership, and executed with the kind of smiling complicity that can only come from years of learning how to manipulate with charm. And what makes it more insidious is how Robyn consistently positioned herself as the emotional victim of the family's disintegration, crying in interviews, lamenting her broken heart, insisting she just wanted everyone to get along, while simultaneously benefiting from every broken bridge, every severed tie, every divorce. Because each wife that left meant less dilution of the financial pot, more focus on her household, and more narrative dominance on a show that was still very much paying out, if not equally, then certainly to someone. And it wasn't Christine who bought $1 million home, and it wasn't Janelle who was funding a nanny, and it definitely wasn't Mary who got her name on the LLC. So where did the money go? And more importantly, how was it decided who received what? Because if the family pot still existed, then where were the financial records? Where were the receipts? Where were the discussions about income splitting and tax burdens? And if the pot had been dissolved, why were the women not notified? And why did it take Christine physically leaving the state before she was able to access and control any equity of her own? And if Janelle had been the financial workhorse of the family, contributing the most income for years, why did she find herself living in an RV, cooking off a small gas stove? while Robyn and Kody were living in a multi-bedroom fortress nestled in the Flagstaff Hills. And while Mary may have had a business outside of the family, it was clear that even she had been excluded from the new power structure, left to operate on emotional fumes until she too realized that the love she'd been clinging to had become a ghost. And the public started asking, is this just favoritism or is this financial warfare? And the more you examine the pieces, the more you realize this was a slow and methodical consolidation of assets and influence that mirrored the tactics of a hostile takeover, only instead of boardrooms and shareholder battles. It happened over dinner tables, production meetings, and private conversations we'll never see on camera. And through it all, the one thread that ties it all together is the nanny. Because the $500,000 spent on her services doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists as the clearest, most damning symbol of the entire strategy, because in a family that once prided itself on communal child-rearing, on sacrifice, on frugality, on shared labor, Robyn hired help, and she did so at a price that could have funded multiple college tuitions, multiple home down payments, multiple emergency surgeries. And while she did that, she accepted the sympathy of viewers, the defense of Kody, and the silence of a family too exhausted, too manipulated, or too loyal to speak up, until they couldn't stay silent anymore. And Christine left, and Janelle left, and Mary left, and all that remained was the empire Robyn had quietly inherited. A house filled with the children whose names were on the LLC, a man who no longer saw his other children as part of the future, and a fan base that no longer bought the illusion of equality. And that's what makes this part of the story so painful. Because it's not just about money, it's about how money reveals values. And every dollar spent on Robyn's comfort revealed that the value system of the Brown family had changed completely. Because where once there was equality, now there was rank, and where once there was unity, now there was a hierarchy, and at the top stood Robyn, not just the legal wife, but the financial queen, the emotional gatekeeper, and possibly the silent architect of one of the most quietly devastating betrayals reality television has ever documented. If all the foregoing was the emotional and financial depletion of the Brown family, then what happens here is the playing out of the final act. A masterful, deeply calculated reorganization of power that took what was originally a plural marriage founded on faith, shared hardship, and shared sacrifice, and reconstituted it as something more akin to a private corporation with single controlling interest. Robyn Brown and her immediate domestic situation, because what many couldn't see early on was that this wasn't merely about favoritism or even imbalance, it was about positioning for the long term, insulation for the bankroll, and the construction of an internal dynasty within the family itself. And while the emotional betrayals were playing out on television for everyone to witness, Christine being pushed aside, Janelle being marginalized, Mary being emotionally frozen out, the actual betrayal was taking place off camera, in bank accounts, business filings, property deeds, and legal constructs that slowly but irretrievably began to remove the other wives and children from the future of the Brown brand. And the most obvious evidence of that is the creation of Dobsark Entertainment LLC, corporate entity whose name is not merely symbolic but appallingly specific. Dayton, Aurora, Brianna, Solomon, Ariella, Robyn, and Kody, each represented in the acronym, each given a legal space in the financial machinery that would direct future income, future royalties, future licensing agreements, and perhaps even control of the intellectual property behind the sister wives' empire. And the question that should haunt every viewer, every former fan, and every family member excluded from that acronym is this: where are the other names? Where is Christine? Where is Janelle? Where is Mary? Where are the 13 original children whose lives were televised, analyzed, and sold on national television for more than 10 years? The answer is as devastating as it is obvious. They're not there. And legally, that means they're entitled to nothing. Not from the show, not from the brand, not from any residuals or spin-offs, not from any monetized future ventures that Dobsark might be structured to support. And if that doesn't sound like a hostile corporate takeover, then you're not paying attention. Because what we have here is a classic case of consolidation, emotional, financial, and operational, and the moment Robyn entered the family, the seeds were planted for that consolidation to grow. First through debt forgiveness, when Robyn's consumer debts were quietly paid off using pooled family funds. Then through asset preference, when Robyn and Kody purchased a nearly $900,000 home in Flagstaff while others lived in rentals or RVs. And finally through legal power, when Kody divorced Mary and legally married Robyn, giving her and her children superior inheritance rights, access to spousal privileges, and the legal authority to represent Kody in any financial matter. And if you think that's just legal housekeeping, then understand that it fundamentally changed the structure of the family, because no matter how many times Kody insisted the family was spiritually united, the law recognized only one wife. And that wife, Robyn, was now not only the emotional partner of Kody, but his legal executor, his business partner, and potentially the gatekeeper of all future access to the income stream generated by sister wives. And so when Dapsark was formed, it wasn't just a business, it was a declaration. A flag planted on conquered territory, a corporate firewall that ensured only one set of heirs would benefit from the decades of sacrifice made by women and children who were no longer legally tied to the patriarch they had once believed would protect them. And that makes the $500,000 nanny bill even more egregious, because it wasn't a one-time expense or a temporary necessity. It was a symptom, a visible expenditure that revealed how differently Robyn was operating within the family structure, how her household had become not a branch of the Brown family tree, but the trunk itself, the only part being watered, nourished, and preserved while the rest were left to wither. And this wasn't an accident, it was design. Because while Christine was packing boxes, crying in confessionals, and making the heartbreaking decision to leave the family she had spent her life building, Robyn was not just staying, she was ascending. And with each wife who left, the financial pie became smaller and smaller, and the remaining pieces more concentrated. And it should be noted that in most plural families, especially those that claim to follow principle-based polygamy, the idea of one pot is sacred, not just symbolically but practically, because it reflects the belief that all wives and children are equal, that resources are shared, and that the family functions as a collective. But in the Brown household, that philosophy crumbled the moment resources began to run dry, and Kody's loyalty began to shift permanently toward Robyn. And what replaced that shared model was a scarcity mindset, a bunker mentality in which everything outside the Robyn household was seen as a threat. Sons who questioned his rules were freeloaders. Daughters who needed medical care were inconvenient. Wives who asked for fairness were traitors. And all of that culminated in the establishment of Dapsark as a formal rejection of the original family values. And the cruelest part is that it was all hidden behind the language of protection and preservation, as if consolidating income streams into a private entity that excluded most of the family was somehow in everyone's best interest. And this kind of manipulation, draped in concern but rooted in control, is textbook financial gaslighting. Because not only were the OG wives excluded from the new structure, they were made to feel guilty for noticing, for asking questions, for suggesting that perhaps something was wrong. And that brings us back to Robyn's public image, which has always been a carefully curated balance of tears, confusion, and righteous indignation. And while many viewers originally sympathized with her as the new wife trying to fit into an established system, over time it became clear that she wasn't trying to integrate. She was trying to reshape the family around herself. And the nanny became the physical manifestation of that reshaping. Because in a household that claimed equality, only one wife had outsourced her parenting. Only one wife could afford private childcare while others raised kids alone. And only one wife seemed to have unlimited access to Kody's time, energy, and most importantly, his financial resources. And the tragedy of this story is that it didn't have to end this way. Because Christine, Janelle, and Mary gave everything. They raised children, they paid bills, they sacrificed careers, they endured public scrutiny, and they kept the family running long before Robyn arrived. And yet, when the dust settled, they were left with nothing but memories, pain, and the burden of rebuilding their lives from scratch. And as they stepped away, reclaiming their voices, and finally telling their sides of the story, the picture became painfully clear. They weren't just emotionally abandoned, they were strategically erased. And the LLC, the house, the nanny, the legal marriage, none of it was coincidence. All of it was architecture. And in the end, what Robyn and Kody created wasn't a family. It was a corporation with a velvet curtain, a dynasty secured not through open love and shared values, but through legal maneuvering, emotional triangulation, and financial hoarding. And that's why the outrage over the nanny isn't going away. Because it's not just about what the nanny does. It's about what her paycheck represents, the moment the dream of sister wives became a business deal, and most of the partners were left out of the contract. And here we come to the verdict, not in a courtroom, not on a piece of paper, but in the hearts and minds of all viewers who watched this family rise and fall, who invested over a decade in a narrative that promised togetherness and ended in quiet betrayal. Because the narrative of Robyn's claimed $500,000 nanny debt isn't so much about a ridiculous expense, it's about the gradual demise of a dream, the unraveling of a covenant, and the systemic erasure of women and children who constructed a brand only to be cut from its largesse. And as the dust settles, the question isn't did Robyn take from the family pot? It's how could she not have? Because when you trace every thread, financial, emotional, legal, they all lead back to a single point. Robyn's household became the center of gravity, the place where Kody's time, energy, and money went, and everyone else, piece by piece, was left outside the orbit. And maybe the most devastating part of it all is that the other wives didn't leave because they stopped believing in plural marriage. They left because they stopped believing in Kody, because they finally realized that the man who once stood in front of a camera and swore he was building a dynasty of love had quietly changed the locks, moved the money, and handed the keys to one wife and one wife only. And if you don't believe that's true, just ask yourself why it took Christine walking away before she saw a return on her home, why Janelle had to live in an RV to prove her independence, why Mary stayed long after her spirit was broken, hoping that loyalty would mean something, only to discover that in Kody's new kingdom, loyalty only flowed in one direction, toward Robyn. And while Kody will say it was about respect, obedience, rules, what it was really about was control. And control is always easiest when the circle is small, when the voices are fewer, when the money flows one way. And that's exactly what we saw happen as each wife departed. The circle shrank, the noise died down, and all that remained was Robyn, sitting in the mansion, mourning the loss of the family she helped unravel while continuing to benefit from the pieces. And now the public sees it too, because the footage doesn't lie. The tears don't lie, the timelines don't lie, and every financial move, from the legal marriage to the Flagstaff house to Dabsark LLC to the unanswered question of who paid for the nanny, all tell the same story. The OG wives and children were not simply collateral damage, they were systematically pushed out. And what was once plural love became a one-woman show, backed by legal authority, padded with luxury, and shielded by crocodile tears. And so the nanny isn't just a scandal, she's a symbol, a walking receipt of privilege in a household that claimed poverty, a living contradiction in a family where other children were left to hustle, to scrape by, to beg for attention or funding while Robyn's kids were handed comfort, gifts, security, and most of all, presence, Kody's presence. And as fans rewatch the show with new eyes, they realize just how often Robyn wept while others suffered silently, how often she said, "I feel bad," while doing nothing to change the conditions that made others feel invisible. And now, with Christine thriving, Janelle rebuilding, and Mary reclaiming her life, what's left is the final image of Kody and Robyn, isolated in their Flagstaff fortress, surrounded not by legacy or love, but by the silence of absence, by the weight of decisions made in secret, by a family that once stood together and now only exists as a memory. And that is the final tragedy of this story, that what was supposed to be a living example of plural harmony became a lesson in favoritism, manipulation, and quiet financial domination. And yes, Robyn may still have the house, the husband, the LLC, but what she doesn't have is the family, the collective bond that made sister wives resonate with millions. And while the law may never rule against her, while no judge may ever demand that the nanny funds be repaid, the court of public opinion has already delivered its sentence. And it's written in the comments, the ratings, the fan reactions, the media coverage. It's written in the eyes of her stepchildren who no longer call, in the voices of the wives who refuse to return, in the legacy that will never quite be hers. Because you can buy comfort, you can secure a title, you can build an LLC and call it family, but you cannot fake love. And you cannot build a dynasty on stolen ground. Because eventually the foundation will crack, and what's left, despite the million-dollar view, despite the tears, despite the legal documents, is just two people, clinging to power in a house that feels more like a museum than a home, haunted by the ghosts of a family they dismantled. And the question the world will keep asking long after the cameras stop rolling is not, did Robyn pay back the $500,000, but what did it cost her to keep it? And the solution, perhaps everything that truly ever counted. And so we stand here today, looking over the rubble of what was once presented to America as a noble social experiment. A multi-family founded in religion, oneness, and common sacrifice, and seeing the last remnants of that dream smolder in the char of deception, of debt, of division. The last chapter of this saga is not one of growth or redemption, but of reckoning. A reckoning not only for Kody Brown as a patriarch, but for the entire ideology that he employed as a cloak to excuse his choices for all these years. When cameras started rolling on sister wives, audiences met a family that was unconventional by mainstream society, but operated under a strict and purportedly righteous system of internal rules. All the wives were equal, all the children loved, and all the money shared. It was this myth that attracted millions in the fantasy that a family of almost 24 could not only survive, but thrive under the burden of mutual love, faith, and resources. But when we finally arrive at the final scenes, a family torn apart, kids disillusioned, and moms financially exhausted, we realized that what was marketed as spiritual unity was, in reality, a sophisticated fiscal apparatus fueled by ego, nepotism, and finally greed. The tipping point wasn't merely emotional abandonment or relational drift. It was fiscal betrayal, orchestrated to the last dollar. Kody, who had been the hub of the family's gravitational force, was now a king without a kingdom. Ruling over a shrinking empire, he rechanneled systematically into one home, one wife, and one carefully chosen group of heirs. The narrative that started with one man and 4 wives joined under a faith-driven model of family concluded with one wife lounging in a $1 million home and the rest fighting for economic autonomy. And the kids, the real constructors of the sister wives empire, whose lives, tears, birthdays, and coming-of-age pains were captured, edited, and sold, were left to sift through the ashes of the bequest that was owed to them and quietly pilfered in full view of the world. Garrison purchasing his own house with no assistance. Gabe sobbing on camera after being emotionally erased. Maddie taking loans from in-laws rather than from her own dad. These aren't television chop drama. These are displays in an open trial. Each and every one another damning shard of proof in the enormous betrayal that played out not in private, but in public. But the scariest aspect of this tale isn't so much what Kody and Robyn did, but how long it took for everyone to notice. For years, viewers, and even some of the wives, made excuses on behalf of religious leadership, plural balance, or dad wisdom. We heard that Kody was overwhelmed, doing his best. Robyn was merely shy, misunderstood. But in the retrospective pain, we realize now the trends that were always present. The little deceptions, the moving goalposts, the recasting of loyalty as acquiescence. We noticed Robyn's home was always newer. Her children always received more attention. Her decisions always trump everyone else's. And we witnessed Kody's gradual evolution from frazzled dad to self-rigorous autocrat, invoking COVID protocols to shield his family not from harm, but from contact and control. His notorious line, "You're living in my house, it's my money," was no accident. It was the last unmasking. The man who had once boasted, "This is all for my family," now stood naked-faced before his sons, proclaiming his riches, his power, and his authority as his own. No more pot of family. No more common fate. Only Kody, the only shareholder in an empire that had been constructed on the unremunerated toil of 3 women and the televised childhoods of 13 children. Robyn, who entered the family in debt and want, left with legal status, a secure home, and complete financial security for her children. Janelle, who spent 2 decades working in real estate and accounting to pay for the family's survival, wound up in an RV. Christine, who brought up half the family, was forced to crowdfund her daughter's health care. Mary, the first wife, who sacrificed her legal rights to benefit Robyn's children, was reduced to seeing her emotional capital dwindle to 0. They all eventually left, not only from a man but from a myth. The myth that they were part of something holy, the myth that love and sacrifice would shield them from being tossed aside. But in leaving, they did something strong. They took back the story. Christine's relocation to Utah was not only a move, it was a statement of economic freedom. Janelle's decision to have separate finances was not only sensible, it was revolutionary. Mary's last split, after having undergone more public humiliation than any woman should have to, was a line in the sand that even the most devoted can, and should, leave behind rot. And what did Kody and Robyn ultimately win? A house? An LLC? A diminishing public reputation? They might have won the control of the physical assets, but they lost the respect of a generation. They are today's symbols of what takes place when power grows into entitlement and love turns into leverage. Their triumph, if one can call it such, is Pyrrhic. Because while they huddle in their gated mansion, protected by papers and LLCs, the public, the court of the people, has rendered its verdict. And it's devastating. Viewers who once sympathized now question. Children who once deferred now demand answers. And the 3 women once on the periphery now are survivors, not only of a failed marriage, but of a financial system that almost extinguished their legacies. The last act of this drama isn't about Kody, it's about them. The women who remained silent for too long and then voiced what was said, who gave everything and yet still found the strength to leave, who now construct new futures for themselves and their offspring from whatever is left of the wealth they assisted in accumulating. And to the audiences, to you, watching these events unravel episode by episode, scandal by scandal, it is no longer, how did this happen? But what are we going to do with what we know now? Because this is more than a tale of one man's fall into selfishness. It's a warning about power, money, loyalty, and the way systems can be used against the people they're supposed to protect. Kody Brown didn't just mishandle a family, he orchestrated the deliberate reallocation of resources from the people who worked for them and into the pockets of people he liked. And now, with the empire laid bare and the illusion gone, we are left with the truth. raw, ugly, inescapable. A truth that should have arrived earlier, a truth that was missed by too many until it was too late. But for those whose lives were hurt, the children who were pushed aside, the women who were used, the fans who were deceived, the truth, at last, is finally revealed. And it is loud enough for the world to hear.